بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على قتلتهم وأعدائهم أجمعين. So one of the most important subjects that I believe must be covered and hasn't really been covered in the English language is a discussion with regards to the trustworthiness of Islamic sources. So can these sources actually be trusted? Are they just all made up on the spot by certain individuals? Or are they in conformity and in unity in such a manner that it would make it highly unlikely for those sources to be just made up, but rather they have been transmitted in an correct manner, generally speaking, and in a manner that can be researched, whereby you can actually differentiate between weaker reports and more trustworthy, more authentic reports. To begin, I'm also going to be intellectually honest that most of the work that I'm presenting right now is actually something that has been carried out by a Kuwaiti student of knowledge by the name of Sayyid Ali al-Hassan. And I've added a few things, and I've also obviously translated it in English, and I've added a few things of my own. So this is going to be a two-part discussion. The first part is going to contain seven angles, I suppose, that would ensure would essentially reduce the likelihood and probability of the sources being just made up, because there are going to be lots of angles that are difficult to be present in works that are made up by liars. Because if liars were to make these things up, those points or those angles are likely not to be there. It would be highly unlikely for them to be there. So this discussion is going to contain 7 points, and I'm going to make another part 2, which is also going to contain another 7 points. So 14 points in total. Now, I'm not claiming that each and every single angle or each and every single point I'm mentioning is sufficient to prove the general trustworthiness of Islamic sources, but it's the combination of those 14 that bring the certainty, that brings upon certainty and essentially there's those 14 points in totality. So one angle or one point could perhaps be interesting, but when combined with the other 13, and when all of them are combined together, this is the real, hard blow, I suppose, or the real argument in of itself. So if you're saying, for example, that point 1 isn't sufficient, well, there's 13 points in total. All of those points cannot altogether be, corroborated and faked. That's the essential argument here. So we'll just begin with the first point. So first and foremost, we find conformity between the Shia sources with the Sunni sources. So what is the point essentially based upon? Well, as I've mentioned to begin with, there are statements found in both sources which are unlikely to be written through corroboration of the opposing parties. So you have one party, one school of thought, one theological position. It is highly unlikely for them to sit together and corroborate ideas about, things that occurred in history. This is highly unlikely. I'm going to give some examples here. So we're going to go into the evidence folder, I suppose. Yep. Okay. So the first piece of evidence that I wanted to mention, or the first example, was the biography of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in Tahdhib al-Tahdhib by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and I'm reading from Tahdhib al-Tahdhib by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in the second volume, page 103. He mentions Ja'far ibn Muhammad ibn Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he gives like a long, description of whom he narrated from and so on. Then he mentions some interesting things, which again is exactly found within the Shia sources, the Shia narratives. But he's not taking from the Shias here. As in Ibn Hajar, he's not using the Shia sources to understand the life and reality of Ja'far al-Sadiq. So he says, قال الداوردي, who is a Sunni, قال الداوردي لم يروي مالك عن جعفر حتى ظهر أمر بني العباس, which means that Malik ibn Anas, who's one of the known four scholars of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam, he did not narrate from Ja'far al-Sadiq until the passing of the Umayyad rulership. So when Bani Umayyah, the Umayyad dynasty, fell and the Abbasid dynasty started, this was the time when Malik ibn Anas would narrate from Ja'far al-Sadiq, which is exactly what shows that historically speaking, during the Umayyad dynasty, there was certain persecution towards individuals who would be close to the household of the Prophet. And this is substantiated in Sunni sources, right? وقال مصعب الزبيري كان مالك لا يروي عنه حتى يضمه إلى آخر, which means that Malik would not narrate from Ja'far al-Sadiq unless he combined Ja'far al-Sadiq with another narrator. So this also shows that one of the giant scholars in Sunni Islam saw some kind of weakness or some kind of issue with Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, which again is both found in the Shia and Sunni sources. This is corroborated, as in the Shias know of this historical reality and the Sunnis know of this historical reality. Then he also mentions that Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan got from him a long hadith regarding Hajj. This hadith is, by the way, found in Sahih Muslim, and a very similar one narrated by Muawiyah bin Ammar, who's going to be an important individual. A very similar narration is found in Al-Kafi. So again, a person is going to have to claim that all of these individuals were either corroborating or just making up history and making up events as they went along, but they all seem to have a very similar outcome, which is again very unlikely. So either they corroborated, which there's no evidence for that, because these individuals were not they wouldn't see eye to eye, as mentioned here, right? Malik would not narrate from Ja'far unless he combined him with another narrator, which shows that the Shia and the imams of the Shia and the imams of the Sunnis would not see eye to eye. So how are they, coming up with exactly the same, historical accounts and narrations? So corroboration is not something that happened, or very unlikely for it to happen. Then Yahya ibn Sa'id also says, ما كان كذوبا. Now, why is that an interesting thing? As in Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, who is again a giant scholar of hadith in Sunni Islam, he says that Ja'far was not a liar. What does that mean? It means that essentially there were individuals who attributed themselves to Ja'far al-Sadiq during his time, who were saying things that Yahya ibn Sa'id would not accept, as in theological things, historical statements that really would not go in line with someone like Yahya ibn Sa'id, which shows that the Shia views were alive in that time. It wasn't just something which Al-Kulaini came up with, or As-Saduq, just out of the blue. They sat and they came up with these things. But then he also mentions that Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash, who is also a known narrator and he's also a known reciter, he asks, he's asked about why he doesn't take hadith from Ja'far al-Sadiq. He says that when we asked him, these narrations, where do you get them from? Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash asks Imam Sadiq, he says, where do you get those narrations from? Then the Imam says, لا ولكنها رواية رويناها عن آبائنا. He says, no, I mean, these are not things that I am just saying from myself, but the things that I'm mentioning are narrations that I've taken from my fathers, which is again an exact statement from Ja'far al-Sadiq found in Shia books, in Al-Kafi, in Basar al-Darajat, and other sources. So you're getting multiple opposing individuals who are saying the exact same thing. So this is just the first example. I'm going to be a bit quicker with my examples now because I know I'm taking a bit of time here. If we take, for example, the biography of Ja'far al-Sadiq and Sir A'lam al-Nubala. So here, we also find the taqiyya concept being present during the time of Imam Sadiq. He's asked عن مسلمة بن جعفر قلت لجعفر بن محمد, which is Imam Sadiq, إن قوما يزعمون أن من طلق ثلاثا بجهالة رد إلى السنة تجعلونها واحدة يروونها عنكم. قال معاذ الله ما هذا من قولنا من طلق ثلاثا فهو كما قال, which essentially means, the translation of this is that this narrator by Imam Maslama, he asks Imam Sadiq, he says to him, people narrate that you claim that if someone was to divorce his wife in one setting 3 times, such a divorce is void and he would have to return back to the prophetic tradition. And people are spreading this about you. Then the Imam says, apparently, I seek refuge to God from such a claim. We have not said this, and I did not say this. Whomever divorces his wife 3 times in one gathering, it is what he said, which means that this is false. By the way, this means that the Imam would again practice taqiyya to save his life from individuals that would punish for having opposing views. Again, the concept of taqiyya is in Shia Islam that our imams would hide their beliefs to protect themselves, and this is also present in Sunni books, right? A lot of the debaters today come forth and have this issue that why do your imams practice taqiyya? Well, because they would be killed if they wouldn't, and they were in fact killed. All of them were killed, right? Despite them being very, careful with the way they spoke. So again, this is another type of conformity. That's taqiyya by Shia imams in Sunni books and taqiyya by Shia imams in Shia books. And those are 2 opposing theological schools that are narrating the exact same thing. Right. Then we have a third example, and this is the biography of a man by the name of Amr ibn Thabit, and this is in Mizan al-I'tidal, volume 3, page 249. Wait, they mention Amr ibn Thabit ibn Abi al-Muqdam ibn Hurmuz al-Kufi. Now again, they all critique him. They say that he's not trustworthy, he's a Rafidi, you know. But there's an interesting part here. بلغني أنه كان عند حبان بن علي فأخبرني ما سمعه يقول كثر الناس بعد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى أربعة, which means that a individual by the name of Hibban ibn Ali had certain individuals listen to Amr ibn Thabit, and Amr ibn Thabit would tell them that everyone after the Prophet apostatized except four. This exact same concept and narration is narrated by Amr ibn Thabit and al-Kafi. So is this conspiracy theorist, when they come and say the Islamic sources are just made up, is the person who wrote Mizan al-I'tidal, they're just going to open up al-Kafi and see Amr ibn Thabit and say, oh, okay, Amr ibn Thabit narrated this, I'm going to mention this in my book also. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Especially since the author of Mizan al-I'tidal didn't get this knowledge from al-Kafi, right? He got this knowledge from Hibban ibn Ali, who was again before al-Kulayni. So again, we have conformity in both sources, right? The fourth piece of evidence, and by the way, one can bring lots of evidence just to support these claims. I'm just trying to be quick about it, despite it not being obvious, but I'm trying to shorten this as much as I can. In the last part here, we have theological statements by Ja'far al-Sadiq in Kitab al-Sunnah by Abdullah ibn Ahmad. Now, Abdullah ibn Ahmad, he's the son of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the fourth imam of the Sunnis in jurisprudence. He mentions a narration. حدثني أبي رحمه الله ثنا موسى بن داود ثنا عبد الرحمن معبد عن معاوية بن عمار الدهني قال قلت لجعفر يعني ابن محمد إنهم يسألون عن القرآن مخلوق هو قال ليس بخالق ولا مخلوق ولكنه كلام الله. So this was a known theological problem and conflict that arose during the time of the Mu'tazili Athari conflict. That is the book of Allah. Is it created or is it uncreated? So here the Imam has asked, is it created or was it uncreated? The Imam, he says, ليس بخالق ولا مخلوق. It is not a creator, nor is it created. It is not a creator. The Quran is not a creator, nor is it uncreated. It is the speech of God. Meaning, don't give the Quran terms and attributes which God Himself did not give. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called the Quran the speech of God, then you call it the speech of God. You do not exceed, nor do you decrease. It's an innovation to go into these lengths. By the way, this exact same concept is narrated in Kitab al-Tawheed by Shaykh al-Saduq as an entire chapter. So you're telling me that Shaykh al-Saduq opened up books of Kitab al-Sunnah by Ahmad al-Hanbal, by Abdullah ibn Ahmad al-Hanbal, and was like, oh, okay, Ja'far al-Sadiq has been narrated this, so let me fabricate a bunch of... Again, this is nonsense. This is also nonsense, because those two were of opposing views, yet they're narrating, as in Abdullah ibn Ahmad al-Hanbal and al-Saduq are of opposing views, and they're narrating the exact same thing, right? Which shows that there's a form of conformity between what the Shia narrate and what the Sunnis narrate, despite the clear theological differences between the two schools. Okay, so that's just the first part that we've gone through. The second part is acknowledgement of trustworthiness despite despite the acknowledgement of trustworthiness, despite the acknowledgement being from our opponents. What do I mean by this? I mean, it's phrased a bit awkwardly, but what I essentially mean is that you have Sunni scholars of Rijal, of biography, who are affirming that Shia narrators are trustworthy. Now, if a Shia biographer said about a certain Shia narrator that he or she was trustworthy, you would say there's bias involved. But when you have someone of opposing theology affirming your trustworthiness, the levels of bias decrease a lot, right? As I've written here, bias is very improbable in this circumstance because you're having an opponent of yours, and this opponent of yours is affirming your trustworthiness despite you being a theological opponent to him. Like, and by the way, this cannot be faked, as in the Shias cannot have faked this, right? If someone wanted to claim that Shia sources or books of hadith or whatever, they fake these things, and they've just some of them use the term makinat al-hadith, as in Sheikh al-Saduq and Sheikh al-Kulaini were just individuals that just sat there and fabricated and made up fairy tales. This is literally out of our control. Those are Sunni scholars. These are Sunni sources. How would the Shia be able to infiltrate? Yeah, okay. Are they teleporting back in time and changing words, or like what kind of a ridiculous conspiracy would you have to come up with now? Okay, so we're going to just go through this list, and I've got some really important narrators. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've got 6 narrators, and this is just an example. It's just a sample of narrators, of important narrators that have been authenticated by Sunni scholars. So the first one is Abdul Malik ibn A'yan. And Abdul Malik ibn A'yan, he's actually the brother of Zurara ibn A'yan and Himran ibn A'yan. And they are known Shia. So what does Abu Hatim al-Razi say about him? He says, من عتق الشيعة محله الصدق صالح الحديث. He said he was someone who the Shia bought as a slave and they released them, or they are descendants of slaves which the Shia bought and they were later released. But he says, what? محله الصدق. But he is trustworthy, he is a truthful person, he only speaks the truth. Then Ahmad ibn Salih says, he is thiqa, he is trustworthy. Then he says, then Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who is known as Amir al-Mu'minin fil Hadith. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is one of the biggest scholars of Hadith in Sunni Islam. He says about Abdul Malik ibn A'yan, Saduqun Shi'i, which means he's a truthful Shia. Al-Dhahabi says the same thing about him. Al-Dhahabi, by the way, he is the student of Ibn Taymiyyah. Right, so these people are not close to the Shia at all, yet they're still affirming the truthfulness and trustworthiness of our narrators. Then, some did critique him, no doubt, again, because of that bias comes in. But the main point is that the general notion is that he's been praised for trustworthiness, despite being of different, theological view. That's the first one. Now we have a very controversial narrator, and he's a very, very important narrator in Shia Islam. His name is Jabir ibn Yazid. Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ju'fi. And some of the biggest scholars of Hadith have actually deemed him to be trustworthy. So if we zoom in here, so we have Sufyan al-Thawri. Sufyan al-Thawri said about him, ثقة, he is trustworthy. وإذا قال حدثنا وأخبرنا فذاك ومرة كان ورعا في الحديث ما رأيت أورع في الحديث منه. Sufyan al-Thawri says that if Jabir says, I heard, or I was told, then it's true, right? He's so trustworthy that if you hear him say, I heard, or I was told, then believe him. And another time he said he was the most careful individual when it came to hadith, when it came to narration. I have not seen anyone who was more careful than him when it came to that. He was wara'. He wasn't someone who was haste, to just take anything. He was very careful with that. Then we have Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj. And Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, to be fair, was one of the more objective individuals. So if he genuinely believed you to be a liar, he would call you a liar. And if he believed you to be truthful, he would call you truthful. He wouldn't look into your theological positions that much. He was one of the more fair, biographers of narrators. What does Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj say about Jabir ibn Yazid? He says, صدوق في الحديث ومرة كان جابر إذا قال حدثنا وسمعت فهو من أوثق الناس. Which means what? That Jabir ibn Yazid, he is trustworthy in hadith, and that if Jabir said, I heard or I was told by, he is from the most trustworthy people to take from. And Waki ibn Haraj also said, Thiqa, others also, praised him, and Zuhair ibn Muawiyah said, كان إذا قال سمعت أو سألت أو سئلت فهو من أو سألت يعني سمعت أو سألت فهو من أصدق الناس. That's again, it's a very similar statement to the ones that we've read before, so it doesn't really need translation. Now some may come and say, but he's been critiqued, you've just ignored everything else. There's an interesting quote that really needs to be taken into consideration here. So Ibn Adi, he mentions ابن عدي الجرجاني, he mentions له حديث صالح وقد احتمله الناس وعامة ما قذفوه به أنه كان يؤمن بالرجعة ولم يختلف أحد في الرواية عنه وهو مع هذا كله أقرب إلى الضعف منه إلى الصدق. Now, he does critique him, generally speaking, but he says that he's got some acceptable narrations. But the main criticism that people have against him is that he used to believe in Raj'a, which is a Shia, theological belief. So it wasn't that most people used to deem him as a liar or a fabricator. No, it's just they have an issue with his theological, opinions. Later on, that developed to not, make it embarrassing. They would say, no, he's a liar. He fabricates. And there's no, substantial evidence to support such a claim. Like, that's Jabir ibn Yazid. Then we have Aban ibn Taghlib al-Bakri. So, Abu al-Fath al-Azdi says, كان غاليا في التشيع وما أعلم به في الحديث بأسا. Which means this guy, Aban ibn Taghlib, he was an extremist when it came to his tashayyu. He had a lot of, tashayyu in him. He was a staunch Shia. But I do not know any issue with his hadith, with his narration. Meaning what? He's trustworthy. Despite his Shia theological standpoint, he's a trustworthy individual. Again, these are opponents saying this. There's not a Shia saying that he's trustworthy. The opponents of this man are affirming his trustworthiness. Like, what more do you want than that? How more can you decrease, or in what ways can you decrease the level of bias more than this? الذهبي, again, the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, says, شيعي جلد لكنه صدوق فلنا صدقه وعليه بدعته. Which means what? He is a staunch Shia, but he is truthful. When he speaks truth. So we will take his narrations because he's truthful, and unto him is his innovation. Right? So it's at that level. Yahya ibn Ma'in, again, a giant scholar of hadith, said he's thiqa, and so on. So again, you've got lots of people who have mentioned that he's trustworthy. So that was Aban Abi Taghlib. Then we have Abbad ibn Yaqub al-Rawajini here. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, again, a giant scholar in hadith, one of the biggest Sunni scholars in hadith. He says, Saduqun Rafidi. He is a trustworthy, a truthful rejecter. Rejecter, by the way, is the highest, level of tashayyu you can get. It's it's this, they're essentially a step away from killing the man, essentially, right? This title, Rafidi, if anyone is accused with that title, it means he's essentially hated by the Sunni scholarship. But despite that, Ibn Hajar says he's truthful. He doesn't lie. Abu Hatim al-Razi says Shaykhun thiqa. He's a trustworthy scholar. And Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, who's the Shaykh of Bukhari, by the way, he says لولا رجلان من الشيعة ما صح لهم حديث. If not for two men from the Shia, two narrators from the Shia, they would not have a single authentic narration. And he mentioned Abbad ibn Yaqub as being one of those trustworthy, extremely trustworthy individuals. Now they acknowledge, by the way, Salih ibn Muhammad says, كان يشتم Uthman. This guy was so clear in his tashayyu and so clear in his rafd, his rejection, his Shiaism, that he would openly curse and insult Uthman. But again, they acknowledge that that he speaks truth. So that was Abbad ibn Yaqub. Then we have Muawiyah ibn Ammar ad-Duhani, who's again a known major narrator of hadith in Shia Islam. So Abu Hatim ibn Hibban al-Wusti, he mentions ذكره في الثقات, that this individual is trustworthy. Ahmad ibn Shu'ayb al-Nasa'i says ليس به ثقة. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani says صدوق. الذهبي says ثقة. Yahya ibn Ma'in says ليس به بأس. Yaqub ibn Sufyan al-Fazawi says ليس لا بأس به. So the general consensus, except for the first opinion here, is that he's trustworthy. Again, despite him being a Shia, you have major scholars like Ibn Hajar, like al-Dhahabi, like Yahya ibn Ma'in, like al-Nasa'i, Sahib al-Sunan, acknowledging the trustworthiness of a known Shia narrator like Muawiyah ibn Ammar. So how can this religion come from fabricators when the opponents of this religion affirm the trustworthiness of the narrators? SubhanAllah. Then you have the last person on this list, and he's quite important, and he's Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Kulayni. And I'm quoting here from Jami' al-Usul by Ibn al-Athir al-Jazari, or Jazari, something like that. Ibn al-Athir, in his book Jami' al-Usul, he mentions Muhammad ibn Yaqub هو أبو جعفر محمد بن يعقوب الرازي الفقيه الإمام على مذهب أهل البيت. This is very, very important. Why? Because first and foremost, this scholar, Ibn al-Athir, is very known in his analysis of history and so on. Second of all, he's saying that this grand jurist is upon the belief system of the Prophet, of the household of the Prophet, that he's upon that belief, right? So he's not someone who's an innovator or someone who's doesn't have a salaf, someone who just made up a religion. No. على مذهب أهل البيت. He's upon the theological standpoint of the prophetic household, right? And who is this Muhammad ibn Yaqub? He is the one who authored and compiled Al-Kafi, right? So again, Sunni scholar saying that Muhammad ibn Yaqub is upon the madhab of the Ahlul Bayt. He's upon the madhab of that Salaf, of the prophetic household, right? Which the Shia are upon. And Ibn al-Jazari, Ibn al-Athir, sorry, is not a Shia as well. He's a Sunni. Right. So that was point number 2. Now point number 3 is, let's bring up the conformity between what biographers wrote in their biographical works with what we find in the chains in the books of narration. So I've written here, if someone wanted to fabricate chains, they would not be able to fully apply all that was written by Al-Najashi, Al-Tusi, Al-Kashi, Ibn al-Ghadari, etc., and ensure complete conformity. There are simply too many variables that can go wrong. I'll give some examples now. So we have, for example, Umar ibn Udayna. Umar ibn Udayna, and Najashi says, Umar ibn Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Udayna, he gives his entire lineage. Then he says, Shaykh Ashabina al-Basriyin. That's Umar ibn Udayna. He's one of our major, predecessors from Basra, which is the southernmost city in modern-day Iraq. Go into the books of narration. Look at a narration from Umar ibn Udayna. You will nearly never ever find Umar ibn Udayna saying, I heard. He's nearly always going to write, I received through a letter, or I wrote. Now, if someone wanted to fabricate, like Al-Kulaini wanted to fabricate and lie and just make up stories, fairy tales, would he, realize those small details? That's, Umar ibn Udayna, he's from Basra, so that's quite far away from Medina Munawwara. Therefore, I'm going to, ensure that I nearly always write that he wrote and received letters and things like that. I mean, look, if your head's a lie, you're just gonna get on with it and never slip, and then slip sometimes. I mean, again, you're not even gonna care about these things, whether he wrote or whether he heard. You're only gonna care about what the lie that you want to present. So these details, right? These really minor details, like the fact that he's from Basra, and when you read his narrations, you nearly always read, if not all the times, but I can't be 100% certain, because you can obviously travel as a human being and hear the imam directly, but he nearly always, if not all the time, mentions that I received a letter or I wrote and I got my reply through a written reply, right? Because he was so far away, he was in Basra. That's the first example. The second example is that we have these Sunni narrators, and we have 6 of them. So I'm just going to go through them quickly because there's 6 of them, and I don't want to, I don't want to waste a lot of time. So I'm just going to mention their names and mention who said that they're Sunni. So the first Sunni narrator that we have, and these are Sunni narrators in Shia books, by the way. So the first Sunni narrator we have is Hafs ibn Ghiyath, and Shaykh al-Tusi mentions that he's Ammi, that he's not a Shia. So that's the first one, Hafs ibn Ghiyath. The second one, is Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim al-Asadi, Basri. And Shaykh al-Tusi mentions that he was a Batri, which means that he's most likely some kind of weaker version of Zaydiyya. Again, this person doesn't have the understanding of Imam that we have, that the Shia have. Right, so that's the second one, Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim. The third narrator, Sunni narrator in Shia books, is Talha ibn Zayd. And Najashi says, Ammi, and Shaykh al-Tusi also says what? Huwa Ammi al-Madhab. But he's, so there's Talha ibn Zayd. before Sunni narrator. Again, this is just a few examples. There are obviously more Sunni narrators in our books, but this is just a few examples. مسعد بن صدق العبدي. This is when Najashi mentions about him, and then Shaykh al-Tusi says, Ammi, that he is not a Shia, he is from the, people that refer to themselves as the Ahl Sunnah. So that's the fourth narrator. The fifth narrator is Ismail ibn Abi Ziyad, يعرف بالسكوني. Najashi mentions that he's known to take hadith from the awam, from these people that refer to themselves as Ahl Sunnah. And Al-Allama mentions him in a book called Al-Khulasa. He says, وقال كان عاميا ونفى الحلي والخلاف في ذلك. There's no dispute about this guy being a Sunni. This guy Ismail ibn Abi Ziyad is definitely a Sunni. Again, scholars, they discuss what theological beliefs that certain narrators have had, and the way they think, because this also is important to know the narrator, generally speaking. The second narrator is this guy named Ali ibn Qurab. Ali ibn Qurab is also a Sunni. So these six narrators, Ali ibn Qurab, and so on, if you were to go back and look at the reports in Shia books, they rarely ever say قال Abu Abdullah. Abu Abdullah said. This title is generally only used by Shia narrators. So for example, when one of those six narrators narrates a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq, they always say Ja'far ibn Muhammad. Why Ja'far ibn Muhammad? Because that's specific. Then when you hear Ja'far ibn Muhammad, okay, it's Ja'far ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. Okay, it's the Madinian Fatimi scholar. He's from the children of Fatima al-Zahra, and he's from Medina, and his father is Muhammad al-Baqir. Then they can follow you. But if you say, for example, let's say someone like Ali ibn Qurab says, حدثني Abu Abdullah. You're going to get a plethora of individuals by the name of Abu Abdullah. So the people are going to get confused. And again, those six narrators do not see Imam al-Sadiq as some kind of infallible imam and so on. They see him like any other narrator. And also, generally speaking, those narrations from those six Sunni narrators, for example, are always connected. So the imam is not going to stop and say, قال Rasulullah. He's always going to say, for example, I heard my father say, Jabir ibn Abdullah said, Rasulullah said. He's always going to connect the chain back to the Prophet. With the Shia, that's not necessary, because the Shia know that Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq is an infallible. So anything that he says is in fact something he's taken from his fathers, going all the way back to the Prophet. So again, if someone wanted to fabricate these narrations and these stories, are they really going to sit in detail? Oh, okay, this guy Ali ibn Ghurab and so on, the Sunni narrators. So most likely they wouldn't call Imam al-Sadiq Abu Abdullah, because people will get confused. The Sunnis will get confused. So they use Ja'far ibn Muhammad, and also they want to connect the chains. What kind of ridiculous conspiracy is this? You can actually make yourself mad if you think that way. Right. So that's again certain details that you wouldn't really put in if you were a liar like that. Then the third piece of evidence is Ibn Fudayl and narrations from his father. For example, so Najashi mentions that his name is Ali ibn Hasan ibn Ali ibn Faddal ibn Umar. And he's a known narrator and so on. And when you go back, he's always narrating things from his father. So روى عن أخويه عن أبيهما علي بن حسن بن فضال عن أبيه عن الرضا عليه السلام. Now the funny thing is that Najashi mentions ولا يعرف الكوفيون هذه النسخة ولا رويت عن من غير هذا الطريق meaning that As-Saduq, he found a book which had a certain chain, and the chain contained this guy, Ibn Fudayl, and his brother, who both narrate from their fathers. The Kufiyun did not know of this. It was only the chain that clarified this reality, that they would always narrate from their father directly, as in they wouldn't narrate from Imam al-Rida alayhi salam without the inclusion of their father. So this could not have been clarified without the biographical works, right? So again, if someone was making things up, they would know of their lies. They would be able to keep them in check, right? But if they're having to rely on biographical works, be like, oh, okay, so the chain says that he narrated from his father, therefore his father must be the connecting dots between the Imam and Ibn Fudayl. This clearly shows that no one is making things up. In fact, there's conformity between what is in the biographical compilations with what is in the books of narration. Right, so that's point number 3. Now, point number 4 is conformity with what is mentioned in the index books, which is called in Arabic faharis, and is taken from the Persian word fahrist, I think, with what is mentioned in the books of narration. So there's a conformity between the books of index and the books of narration. So we have Ubaydullah ibn Ali. Ubaydullah ibn Ali, he has a book with a specific chain, and his narrations regarding jurisprudence match the chain of this book, a sign that those narrations are from his book. Yeah, okay, so Ubaydullah ibn Ali, Najashi, he mentions about him some things, where he lived and his lineage and so on. Then he mentions the chain here. He mentions the chain of that book, which he has regarding jurisprudence. He says, أخبرنا غير واحد عن علي بن حبشي الكاتب الكوفي عن حميد بن زياد عن عبيد الله بن أحمد بن نهيك عن ابن أبي عمير عن حماد عن الحلبي. Now, if you go back to Al-Kulayni and Al-Basair, also longer down, there's actually a chain in the Safar, but this chain is in Al-Kulayni, in Al-Kavi. So if you go back to certain portions of Al-Kafi, Al-Kulayni has a chain of narration. Ali ibn Ibrahim from his father, from Ibn Abi Umayr, from Hammad, from Al-Halabi. Right? So the chain starts out from 2 different sources, then they connect. So again, what's Al-Kulayni going to do again? Is he going to run around trying to get connections with chains to make a lie? Again, these things don't make any sense. This conformity, this unity between 2 differing sources, which is very difficult to keep up with, is going to heavily reduce the likelihood that there's talk about some kind of major conspiracy, that someone is making things up. So that's the first piece of evidence. Now, the second piece of evidence is Mu'ayyah ibn Ammar, and he's someone who we've mentioned quite a few times now. If you remember him, he's also the authentic or trustworthy Shia narrator. He comes up again. And he's, again, Najashi mentions him that he's, really great from our companions and or from our predecessors, and he mentions his lineage and so on. Then he says, amongst the books that he had, Kitab al-Hajj. And Shaykh al-Tusi mentions the exact same thing. Minha Kitab al-Hajj. Go into the books of Hadith, Al-Kafi, Al-Faqih, Tahdhib. The main narrator who narrates about pilgrimage, Islamic pilgrimage, is Mu'ayyib ibn Ammar. He is the dominant narrator regarding Hajj. So again, is someone like a Najashi, for example, and al-Tusi going to open up previous books of narration and see the name Mu'ayyib ibn Ammar appearing a lot? Like, oh, okay, so I'm going to lie and say that he had a book on Hajj. But again, what kind of, this is just nonsense. But, so that's the second piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence is an individual by the name of Al-Hasan ibn Abbas. Now, this narrator, he's weak. He's been weakened and he's been critiqued. Al-Hasan ibn Abbas ibn al-Harish, al-Razi. This is what Najashi says about him. ضعيف جدا. He's a very, very weak narrator. له كتاب إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر وهو كتاب رديء الحديث مضطرب الألفاظ. He has a book, an exegetical commentary work on the chapter إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر in the Quran. It's one of the shorter chapters. It's called the chapter of destiny in English, I suppose. So in this book of his, he's got lots of weak narrations, right? Which are odd in meaning and so on. In Al-Kafi, there is a heading or a chapter called Bab Inna Anzalnahu fi al-Qadr. Read that chapter in Al-Kafi, which is again taken from, the majority of narrations are from who? Al-Hasan ibn Abbas ibn Harish, which means that most likely those narrations in that chapter in Al-Kafi are taken from his book. So again, you see the conformity that the Najashi and Ibn al-Ghalairi mentioned, that he has this weird, weak book with odd narrations, with weird meanings, right? You open Al-Kafi, you see that being true. You read those narrations, they're all odd. So how is that conformity happening, right? Is someone just walking around opening the book of Al-Kafi, seeing these narrations, like, oh, okay, so I'm going to say that so I'm going to make up a story and say that he had a book, and this book is really odd. And so, again, this is nonsense. It's just, it becomes really weak and conspiratorial in that way. Right, so that's the second piece of evidence. The third or the fourth piece of evidence. So we've mentioned Mu'ayyib ibn Ubaydullah ibn Ali, which is the first piece of narration. Then Mu'ayyib ibn Ammar, the second piece of evidence. Al-Hasan ibn Abbas, the third piece of evidence about Inna Anzalnahu fi al-Qadr, that book of his that was really, really weird. Now we're going to mention the fourth piece of evidence, which is Mufaddal ibn Umar. Now, Mufaddal ibn Umar, he's a controversial narrator who's been differed about. Some praised him, some, not so much. Yeah, I mean, he's just someone who's been differed about. Some people praised him, some people critiqued him. For example, Al-Najashi says, مفضل ابن عمر أبو عبد الله كوفي فاسد المذهب مضطرب الرواية لا يعبأ به وقيل إنه كان خطابيا وقد ذكرت له مصنفات لا يعول عليها وإنما ذكرنا للشرط الذي قدمناه كتاب ما افترض الله على الجوارح من الإيمان وهو كتاب الإيمان والإسلام والرواة له مضطربو الرواية. Point being is, Najashi is really not happy with this guy. Najashi really does not like Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar. But that's just his historical conclusion from reading about the man and from hearing details about the life of the man. He says this guy is really not someone to take hadith from. He's an exaggerator, a polytheistic kind of individual. He doesn't really have the core of Islam in him. He's someone who's a Khattabi. Khattabiyun were a form of exaggerators, form of ghulat, who used to worship the imams and so on. So this guy is not a Muslim, essentially. He's really not happy with him. But the point being is he says that Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar has a book called مَفْتَرَضَ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْجَوَارِحِ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ. That's what God has ordained upon the limbs to testify in faith, something along those lines. And he has the chain of that book. He says, أخبرنا أبو عبد الله بن شاذان قال حدثنا علي بن حاتم قال حدثنا أبو عمر أحمد بن علي الفائدي عن الحسين بن عبيد الله بن سهل السعدي عن إبراهيم بن هاشم عن بكر بن صالح عن القاسم بن بريد بن معاوية عن أبي عمر وعن الزبيري عن المفضل بن عمر. This is the chain. Now, do you know, there's actually a funny thing. It's not really funny in terms of it being laughable, but it's a really interesting thing. In Usul al-Kafi, in al-Kafi, there's actually a generational printing error or a generational misunderstanding that throughout generations, those who copied down al-Kafi have misunderstood a certain thing. What is it? Let's first and foremost read the chain from al-Kafi. The chain is Ali ibn Ibrahim Ali ibn Ibrahim narrates from his father, whom narrates from Bakr ibn Saleh, whom narrates from Al-Qasim ibn Buraid, whom narrates from Abu Amr al-Zubayri, whom narrates from Abi Abdullah, and then says alayhi salam. قال قلت أخبرني عما ندب الله عز وجل المؤمنين إليه من الاستباق إلى الإيمان فقال قول الله عز وجل سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم وجنة عرضها كعرض السماء والأرض أعدت للذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله والحديث الطويل أخذنا منه موضع الحاجة. You know, as Al-Qurani says. Now, the actual thing is we can see the chains connecting. So the chain from Al-Kafi starts with Ali ibn Ibrahim, then after عن أبيه إبراهيم بن هاشم بكر بن صالح القاسم بن بريد عن أبي عمرو وعن الزبيري here عن أبي Abdullah. Now عن أبي Abdullah here, the ones who copied down Al-Kafi throughout generations thought that Abi Abdullah here means Imam al-Sadiq, right? And this is, by the way, a known mistake in some books. Like, for example, sometimes it says Abu Ja'far and they write beside it alayhi salam, but sometimes it's talking about Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, for example, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, right? So sometimes Shia scribes, when they just read the kunya or the title of an individual, and this title matches with the title of an imam, they immediately think that it's the imam, and it's not. Now, how has this been discovered? Through the books of index, through al-faharis. So how can there be a lie that has been made up, or someone who is fabricating stories, when the actual scribes are completely misled and think that Abu Abdullah here means the Imam. It means Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. And this could not have been discovered without the books of index and their chains. So again, this clearly shows that there's no conspiracy going on here. There's no lie of these major things, going on in the background, and all these details being kept protected. And whilst one side correcting another side, this is all highly unlikely for there to be some kind of conspiracy and people are making things up. Right. So that was really an interesting piece of evidence to show. Now we have the fifth piece of evidence: conformity of the chains of narrators in different books. Now, So different chains in the lower part of the chain, then they're combined when going higher in the generations, despite the compilers being different and compiling narrations in different areas. So you've got, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many scholars of hadith that are compiling narrations. When you go in their books and their sources, you see that the closer source to the compiler, they're different names. But when you go higher up in the chains, they start to connect, and they start to go back to the main source. So I've also written here, this indicates that there are multiple sources taken from fewer original sources. So in the later generations, you've got a large plethora, and when you go higher and higher up, you see the chains of narration connecting, going back to the exact same source. So this is again something which is also very difficult to just fabricate and make up. And I'm going to show a really interesting narration in this regard. So there's a narration from Mu'awiyah ibn Ammar again about Hajj, about pilgrimage. One portion is found in Al-Kafi with one chain, and the remaining portion of the narration is found in At-Tahdhib with a chain also going back to Mu'awiyah ibn Ammar with different narrators. Okay, so let's see the narrations and compare them. Okay, so let's bring the initial narration. So this is from Furu al-Kafi, volume 4, page 469. So the chain is Ali ibn Ibrahim عن أبيه عن ابن أبي عمير ومحمد بن إسماعيل عن الفضل بن شادان عن صفوان بن يحيى وابن أبي عمير عن معاوية ابن عمار عن أبي عبد الله. The narration is quite long. Then it says وأن تجاوز عن خطيئتي ثم اجعل التقوى من الدنيا زادي ثم افض حين يشرق لك ثبير وترى الإبل موضع إخفافها يعني وترى الإبل موضع إخفافها. Then we go to the Tahdhib Ahkam by Sheikh al-Tusi, and this time it's not actually from one of the earlier narrators. It's an entirely different chain. It's from Musa ibn al-Qasim عن إبراهيم الأسدي عن معاذ بن عمار عن أبي عبد الله عليه السلام قال ثم أفض حين يشرق لك ثبير. Right? وترى الإبل مواضع أخفافها وترى الإبل مواضع أخفافها. قال أبو عبد الله عليه السلام كان أهل الجارية يقولون أشرق ثبير and so on. So you can see that the narration is really long. It might even be from the book of Mu'awiyah ibn Ammar regarding Hajj. And because the narration is so long, the scholars have chopped the narrations into bits. So At-Tusi, he basically received some part of it, and Al-Kulaini received another part of it. So how can there be any, how are they fabricating things if they didn't even get the full package, the entire narration in of itself, despite one narration finishing the other one, and they're just like puzzles matching with each other. There can't be any, conspiracy or any lies being cooked up in this manner if you have this kind of unity between narrations. Right. So that was the one piece of evidence that I had there. Right. So here we have an interesting piece of evidence that I wanted to bring up, and that is conformity between the narrations and the newly discovered books which were not available. So we've got newly discovered books. You find them in libraries, you find them in like an archaeological dig, I suppose, or whatever. A newly discovered book that's not been printed, it's not really readily available. And you find conformity between those newly discovered books and between the known books of narration. So an example of this was the Usul al-Sittat Ashar, which means the 16 books, I suppose. And one of them is Kitab Asim ibn Humayd al-Hannat. Now this book, the book of Asim ibn Humayd, it contains a chain of narration which is not found in our books, in our readily available books, right? A completely different chain. Now this book of Asim, it contains roughly 100 narrations. Half of those narrations can be found in other books, right? So how can there be a type of conspiracy, people making things up when you're finding and discovering books, newer books that have the exact same narrations, either from other narrators or with a few different wordings in other books. So this idea of this, conformity being present, it cannot happen with a conspiracy like that when you discover a new book, right? Now some may say, what about the other half? Well, the other half is found with different mutun, as in with different wordings, right? So even the other half is also, present in our books. Then there's also another newly discovered books, which is called An-Nawadir. Now this book is attributed to Al-Ash'ari, not Al-Ash'ari, the leader of the Ash'ari madhab. It's just they have a similar name, but it's not the Ash'ari I'm talking about. It's a Shia Ash'ari. But most likely, some scholars say that this book is actually by Hussein ibn Sa'id. It's not by Al-Ash'ari. It doesn't really matter. The point being is that you can see that there's clear conformity that this book is by Hussein ibn Sa'id. That's why the scholars say that it's by him, most likely not by Al-Ash'ari. The book known as Nawadir. Nawadir means the rare narrations, the unknown rare narrations. Now, the interesting thing about this book is, and it's newly discovered, so you can't say that it just appeared out of nowhere. I mean, it's a book that's existed, but it hasn't been edited and printed out to be made readily available. So you can't say there's a conspiracy involved, right? The interesting thing about this book is books like Al-Kafi, known books of hadith, have sometimes printing errors, and scribes make mistakes when they write hadith down over time. Of course, that's a reality that is present in all books, essentially, that aren't mass memorized like the Quran, like the Islamic book, the Quran. It's been mass memorized, which completely annuls that possibility. But the books of hadith are not memorized as much, so it relies a lot upon writing and things like that, and mistakes can be made, right? Like the mistake we saw with Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. In reality, this Abu Abdullah is Mufaddal ibn Umar. He's a companion. He's not the infallible imam. Anyways, but when we return to this book and Nawadir, we can fix the mistakes made in the readily available books, which again shows this conformity, that there's no, some kind of conspiracy going on when the actual books are correcting one another, right? Now, here we have evidence 7, or the 7th angle, and there's pieces of evidence under that angle 7, I guess, or point 7, call it what you want. And point 7, it's basically conformity with the narrations and the problems that arose during the time of the imams. Now this point is again about the historical consistency to begin with, which means that the narrations in the book of hadith are historically consistent. Now some may say, well, again, Al-Kulaini, Al-Tusi, and Al-Saduq, and so on, they came after these historical events, so they would have known. So what's the special thing here? What's the gotcha point? Well, the gotcha point is, if you want to make up a lie and just want to bring up your theological standpoints and beliefs, and you really don't care about telling the truth, you're not going to care about the historical content or being historically consistent. For example, in the the Gospel of Barnaby, or whatever it's called, or the Gospel of Barnaby, the one that supposedly mentions the name of the Prophet Muhammad. One of the main issues with that Gospel is that it contains ahistorical information, information which is not historically consistent, right? Generally speaking, and in all authentic narrations, there's historical consistency. There isn't anything which is ahistorical, which is, out of the ordinary, which is extraordinary. And I will come with a few examples. So, the first piece of evidence I'm going to bring to support this claim is, for example, the Hanafis. They have an opinion that laughter makes one's ablution, wudu, void. So wudu in Arabic means ablution. It's the ritual that you carry out before praying if you're in a state of minor impurity. Anyways, so the Hanafis, they have this opinion that if you laugh, your ablution is void. Imam Sadiq mentions that this is not the case. It will only make your prayer void. So let's bring out the narration. Yes, so it's Al-Kafi, volume 3, page 364. This sixth narration here. علي بن إبراهيم عن أبيه عن ابن أبي عمير عن جميل الدراج عن زرارة عن أبي عبد الله عليه السلام قال القهقهة لا تنقض الوضوء وتنقض الصلاة وتنقض الصلاة. So it means basically that excessive laughter or laughter does not make your ablution void. It's not going to affect your ablution. If you can laugh as much as you want, but it will make your prayer void. Again, why would someone, a liar, someone who's just, want to make up things and make up a theological standpoint, sit and write these narrations? I mean, you'd have to be insane to do that. It's a waste of time, right? This is a clear sign that he got these narrations from chains from previous generations that had to deal with these historical issues, right? And they're completely irrelevant in our day and age. I mean, who the hell goes around and thinks that laughter makes your prayer void? So why include these narrations to begin with? The reason as to why I included them, because they were historically relevant, right? Which shows this historical consistency in the narrations. Now, the second piece of evidence I'm going to mention is the difference of opinion regarding beer. Now, this might sound surprising to some, but beer is not forbidden by consensus. Abu Hanifa, for example, he does not see beer, which is an intoxicant, by the way. I mean, we're not talking about beers that don't intoxicate. No, this is an intoxicant. But Abu Hanifa says that the only thing that's forbidden is for oneself to be intoxicated. So you cannot drink beer to the point where you get drunk. But drinking beer in of itself is not haram, right? He says only drinking wine is haram. Again, we read in the narrations that the Ahlul Bayt refuted this, that they said, no, beer is like wine, is like vodka, whatever, vodka didn't exist at the time, but again, all of these intoxicants are haram, whether in a small amount or in a large amount. Let's go back to the hadith, the second piece of evidence. Show that. Okay. So this is again Al-Kafi, volume 6, page 423. محمد بن يحيى عن محمد بن أحمد عن محمد بن عيسى عن الوشاء قال كتبت إليه يعني رضا عليه السلام أسأله عن الفقاع قال فكتب حرام وهو خمر ومن شربه كان بمنزلة شارب الخمر قال وقال أبو الحسن الأخير عليه السلام لو أن الدار داري لقتلت بائعه ولجلدت شاربه وقال أبو الحسن الأخير عليه السلام حده حد شارب الخمر قال عليه السلام هي خميرة استصغرها الناس. The narration includes a clear kind of frustration from the Ahlul Bayt, from the prophetic household, as to how people have made beer and intoxicants permissible under this ridiculous guise, which again shows historical consistency, that you're bringing a non-issue and putting it in your book. Why would you bring a non-issue? I mean, the Shia, by consensus, believe that that any intoxicant is haram. So why would you bring such a narration about a solidified matter? Which again shows that there's historical consensus that they're taking these narrations with their historical context, even though they don't really have that much of an impact in our daily lives, which shows their trustworthiness and their reliability in transmission. So the narration is essentially this companion of Al-Rida alayhi salam, one of the imams of the Shia. This companion is called Al-Washa. He says, "As'aluhu an al-fuqah." I sent a message to Imam Rida asking him about beer. Is this permissible? Is it not? Because people were drinking it, but just saying that I'm going to drink it to the point where I'm not going to get drunk. Anything other than that is permissible. I can drink beer, but as long as I'm not drunk, it's fine. Then the Imam replied. He said, "This is haram. This is impermissible. This is forbidden. وهو خمر, and it is a form of intoxicant. And whomever drinks it is upon the same level as the one who drinks wine. There's no difference between drinking beer and drinking wine. Your deed, the action that you're doing is the exact same." Then he also said, Abu al-Hasan al-Akhir alayhi salam, Imam al-Kadhim, the father of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, he says, لو أن الدار داري لقتلت بايعه ولجلدت شاربه. If I was upon the chair of rulership, I would have executed the seller and lashed the drinker. Meaning, I would treat that individual who corrupts society through beer and through intoxicants the exact same way I would treat an individual who corrupts society and introduces this kind of filth, like wine. Wine, beer, it doesn't matter. Any intoxicant is filth. It must be removed from society. I would execute the seller, and I would lash the drinker. Then he also says, حده حد شارب الخمر. The punishment of a person who drinks beer is the exact same punishment as a person who drinks wine. وقال عليه السلام هي خميرة استصغرها الناس. And he, the Imam, peace be upon him, said, it is a minor form of wine which people have, made easy and just disregarded. They don't see it as a serious thing. Why? Because you need to drink more to be intoxicated. It's not like wine. With maybe a glass of wine, you're already drunk. With beer, you need maybe a liter to get drunk. This is not a measure in the eyes of Allah Azza wa Jal. Anything that can realistically make you intoxicated is haram, even in small, volumes. Right. The third piece of evidence is what is known as al-talaq al-bid'i, which is the innovated form of divorce. Now, this is a matter which, by the way, all four schools of thought, all four schools of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam, they permit this. What is al-talaq al-bid'i to begin with? Al-talaq al-bid'i is basically a man, and we actually did mention this in the first point, as far as I remember, where Imam Sadiq practiced taqiyya and said, no, I did not forbid this. The point being is that al-talaq al-bid'i is essentially a man, he says to his wife, Anti taliq, taliq, taliq. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. In all four schools of Sunni jurisprudence, this counts. As in, he's divorced his wife 3 times in one sitting. This counts. And this opposes the prophetic tradition, this opposes the Quran, it opposes everything. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, لِعِدَّتِهِنْ. if you divorce them, they have to actually carry out an iddah, a waiting period. You can't just start, quick firing and oozing out like an Uzi, like an AK-47, just spraying out, you're divorced, you're divorced, you're divorced. What is this? It's ridiculous, right? And by the way, the first Sunni scholar to oppose this is Ibn Taymiyyah in the 8th century. And he was in prison for this, by the way. So he was in prison for opposing an obvious thing that should be opposed. Right. So let's bring out certain narrations that talk about this issue. Again, it shows the historical consistency, because the Shia did not have this problem, because it's known in Shia Islam that it's not permissible. So why would someone sit there and waste their time and fabricate narrations about a thing which is known in Shia theology? Right. So this is Al-Kafi, volume 6, page 56. Now the actual chapter has got quite a scary / funny name. And باب أن الناس لا يستقيمون على الطلاق إلا بالسيف. These people are never going to divorce properly unless we have the sword ready to go. Because they're sitting there oppressing these women, oppressing families, and coming up with these ridiculous principles. But the point being is that this is not permissible. You cannot divorce 3 times in one sitting, right? The narration is حميد بن زياد عن الحسن بن محمد عن الحسن بن حذيفة عن معمر بن عطاء وشيكة قال سمعت أبا جعفر عليه السلام يقول. This is the 5th Imam al-Baqir عليه السلام يقول لا يصلح الناس في الطلاق إلا بالسيف ولو وليتهم لرددتهم فيه إلى كتاب الله عز وجل. That basically those people are never going to understand how to divorce properly and how to treat people properly unless the sword is ready. And if I was upon the chair of leadership, I would have returned them back to the book of Allah, to the book of God, to the Quran, to teach them how to divorce properly. You don't mess around with people. Second narration is, this is the authentic narration from Abi Basir. Abi Ja'far عليه السلام قال لو وليت الناس لعلمتهم كيف ينبغي لهم أن يطلقوا ثم لم أوت برجل قد خالف إلا أوجعت ظهره ومن طلق على غير السنة رد إلى كتاب الله عز وجل وإن رغم أنفه. Basically, that, again, this is the 5th Imam also saying that if I was upon the chair of leadership, I would tell the people how to divorce properly. And if I see a man divorcing his wife, for example, in this manner of sitting 3 gatherings, oppressing her, just throwing her out like that, I would make his back experience pain, which is an allusion to a punishment, to a corporal punishment through lashing. ومن طلق على غير السنة رد إلى كتاب الله عز وجل وإن رغم أنفه. And if a person divorces in a manner which opposes the prophetic tradition, they have to return back to that tradition. It's not up to you. It's a religion, right? So those are the 3 pieces of evidence that I wanted to present. And there's also more. So this isn't a rare feat or a rare occurrence in the books of narration. So you've got, for example, in Sira A'lam al-Nubala by al-Dhahabi, where there's talks about how Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, La jabra wa la tafweed. This idea that there is no, God does not force you to do things, nor does God leave you completely, to choose everything. For example, to be able to choose where you were born, who your parents are, things like that. So it's something in the middle. You're not completely open to make all choices, nor are you forced in terms of your actions. It's something which is in the middle, right? And this again can be found in Shia books as well. where the imam is replying to these newly theological concepts like the Jabriya and the Qadariya. The Jabriya are essentially people who believe that we are all forced by God to do everything. We have no free will. And the Qadariya are people that deny predestiny and the divine decree. So they're the other extreme. They basically say God has no power over us. Essentially, we do as we want to do. Right? The Imam refuted that, which is again an example of historical consistency. Right. Now, the last bit that I wanted to mention is a final admission from a staunch opponent of the Shia. Right. So Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, and from the statements we can actually conclude the following: that tawatur in Shia books of narration is sufficient, and it would be of major arrogance to deem all Shia narrators as liars and fabricators. This statement is from the direct student of Ibn Taymiyyah, another staunch opponent of the Shia. So again, we've got staunch opponents of the Shia, opposers of the Shia, saying that you can actually deduce mass transmission from the books of the Shia alone, from the books of narration of the Shia alone. So let's read his statement. So in Al-Sawa'iq al-Mursala, volume 2, page 616, he says, الوجه التاسع أن فقهاء الإمامية من أولهم إلى آخرهم ينقلون عن أهل البيت أنه لا يقع الطلاق المحلوف به، وهذا متواتر عندهم عن جعفر بن محمد وغيره من أهل البيت، وهب أن مكابرا كذبهم كلهم وقال قد تواطؤوا على الكذب عن أهل البيت، ففي القوم فقهاء وأصحاب علم ونظر في اجتهادهم، وإن كانوا مخطئين مبتدعين في أمر الصحابة، فلا يوجب ذلك الحكم عليهم كلهم بالكذب والجهل. وقد روى أصحاب الصحيح عن جماعة من الشيعة وحملوا حديثهم واحتج به المسلمون، ولم يزل الفقهاء ينقلون خلافهم ويبحثون معهم، والقوم وإن أخطأوا في بعض المواضع لم يلزم من ذلك أن يكون جميع ما قالوه خطأ حتى يرد عليهم هذا لو انفردوا بذلك عن الأمة، فكيف وقد وافقوا في قولهم من قد حكينا قولهم وغيره ممن لم تقف على قوله. So basically, he's saying that the scholars from the Imamiyya, from the Shia, from the first scholar they have to the last scholar, right? They all narrate from one another that that divorce and mahluf bi, as in when you essentially swear by God that if you do X, you're divorced, right? This opposes the Sunnah. It's not something that counts. That's not the important bit. But he says هذا متواتر عندهم, that this is something which is mass transmitted in their sources from Ja'far ibn Muhammad and others from the Ahlul Bayt. Then he says وهب أن مكابرا كذبهم كلهم وقال قد تواطؤوا على الكذب عن أهل البيت. He says, imagine if somebody, an arrogant individual, a fool, right, comes up and says that all of these, hundreds of narrators who are split away from each other. One is in Iran, one is in Iraq, one is in Medina, one is in Basra, one is in Kufa, one is in Basra, one is in Qom, one is in Ar-Ray, one is in the Levant. All of these different geographical locations, getting sources from different places, that they all agreed with one another. They have this magical WhatsApp group where they all, share information magically, and they all made this up. He said, how can you make such a claim? For within that group, the Shia, they have people of knowledge, and they have jurists, and they have people who have ijtihad, right? And he says, وَإِنْ كَانُوا مُخْطِئِينَ مُبْتَدِعِينَ فِي أَمْرِ الصَّحَابَةِ, even though those Shia are innovators when it comes to the issues of the companions. this does not mean that they are all liars. So they have innovated certain issues with their opinions regarding the companions of the Prophet. This does not make them all liars. فلا يوجد ذلك الحكم عليهم كلهم بالكذب والجهل وقد روى أصحاب الصحيح عن جماعة من الشيعة that certain people who compiled authentic narrations, they narrated from the Shia. Right, so for example, Abbad ibn Ya'qub, the narrator that I mentioned, is actually the Shaykh of Bukhari, right? And he's a Shia, and al-Bukhari took hadith from him, right? The point being is he's saying that the Shias have clear mistakes and clear wrongdoings in their theological beliefs. But it's just simply too idiotic and too, you have to be an arrogant fool to just call all of them liars, right? And this statement is not from a Shia because he's actually criticizing Shiism as he's saying this, but he's saying this, right? And being a staunch enemy of the Shia. So he's not someone who's an ally of the Shia and he likes the Shia and he's just theologically in disagreement with them. No, he's an actual enemy, as in he hates the Shia. Yet he cannot bring himself to say that they're all liars, because that's a ridiculous claim to come up with, right? So if a staunch enemy can realize this, then any rational person should also realize this, right? So that's the 7 points that we've mentioned in this gathering, and inshallah ta'ala we'll mention the other 7 points in another video that we're going to make. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على قتلتهم وأعدائهم أجمعين.